So thanks, and thanks for staying. And I want to first start out by congratulating Craig and Maureen and Faraz on executing flawlessly in this terrific meeting, the first standalone meeting that OIS has had, and I think that they did a phenomenal job. And I appreciate being invited not only to this meeting, but to moderate this fantastic panel of all-stars. I think we've got a great and very broad set of people over here who can give us terrific and very impactful advice and answers. So let me start with Paul Bresky, who's the CEO of Ray Therapeutics, Rayal Mazansky, who is from Deep Track Capital, Annabelle Samimi, who's from Stifel Financial, Cameron Taylor, who you've heard from B of A, and Chen Yu, who's from TCG Crossover. So before I start, let me just show just a couple of slides here just to kind of level set, and this probably sort of in my own naive way sort of reiterates what John and Cameron said earlier on. And this will level set pretty much where the pharma world is and perhaps kind of come down to where we are in ophthalmology. As far as the pharma world is concerned, if you look at the trends from 2018, there's actually a fair amount of capital that's gone in our business. It's investors that are generalists as well as specialists, and there's really a record amount of capital that we have at this point. But we're in kind of an unusual situation where there seems to be a great disconnect. So although there's a lot of capital, what we're used to seeing are these mega M&As and exits, and we really haven't seen that at all for quite some time. And I'd like to have the panelists sort of comment on this as well. Now, large pharma or strategics seem to be still involved, but not to the extent of really having these massive or large M&As that we're used to seeing. And if you look at all the selected ophthalmology transactions, and I'm sorry it's so small, but you can take my word for it. There are lots of transactions out there, but not just the mega deals that we're used to seeing, and it's obviously trickled down to ophthalmology as well. But let me spend a little bit of time on this. These are the key observations in ophthalmology. It's been a difficult year for most, but ophthalmology in general has done pretty well. I think there's still a great deal of excitement and optimism regarding ophthalmology that'll grow. The focus is primarily on retinal diseases without being self-serving, including AMD, as you could tell by that rapidly vociferous, enthusiastic GA panel, and also DME, fueling the positive investor interest here, and also some interest here on dry eyes as well as glaucoma. Now in Retina, Regeneron continues to lead the way. Investors are looking, as was said by John and Cameron as well, as late-stage companies, really. Despite some clinical setbacks that we've had. And despite the IPO and public financial limitations, there's still a lot of money that's come our way, over $1 billion by now. There's still interest in ophthalmology from big pharma, as you can see by some transactions there, but just not the kind of mega deals that we're used to seeing. So with that in mind, we can turn the slides off. Let me just turn to the panel. Cameron, let me start with you. So what we've heard, at least what we've seen, is that, you can turn the slides off, by the way. That's the last one I have. You can just turn all the slides off, yep. Is that there are some companies that still remain active in ophthalmology, and as an example, AbbVie, maybe Roche. There are some that are on the sidelines, Pfizer, Merck. There are some that have announced that they're completely exiting, like Novartis. I mean, do you agree with that? What do we make of all of that? When are we going to see them come back? Are we ever going to see them come back? What's your take on that?
So I think in part, you've had some of the historical franchises that existed probably well over a decade ago with Pfizer, with the, frankly, latanoprost franchise. They weren't able to bridge into the retina despite trying, and frankly saw the anti-VEGFs really take a different trajectory and weren't able to get into that market. Merck, you could say the same thing, also had a pretty successful glaucoma franchise. I think in order for them to get back, I think what's big about all of these other large pharmas that do touch, and we can be open about, right? Novartis has been rumored now to be thinking about ophthalmology. That is something where the ophthalmology business competes with all of their other therapeutic areas. And so from a scale perspective, historical products that were great products in the $200 million, $500 million range, I think that very much shifts the overall strategy for these large pharma companies because, as I mentioned, right, they need growth and they really are going to need to look at scale. So I think in part it will be when companies in this field continue to de-risk and show line of sight into these big indications, there's going to be an opportunity. But certainly, I think we've seen a little bit of a diminished overall field, but they will come back if there are markets available.
Yep. Thanks. And Chen and Rael, this is directed to you, but either of you, anybody, by the way, as I ask these questions, please jump in, any of you guys. So from not just a strategic's point of view, but from your colleagues, the other investors, what are the catalysts that people are waiting for? Are there particular fields, are there particular mechanisms of actions they're waiting for? What is the catalyst to get this going?
Yeah, maybe I'll begin, Praveen. I would say, we focus a lot in back of the eye diseases and retinal diseases. Clearly, we've got two drugs in front of the FDA shortly to be in front of the FDA in dry AMD, where I think everyone's waiting to see how the FDA will opine on both of these drugs. And I would also say that from a clinical trial and development and commercialization point of view, looking at, for example, what happened to Regeneron's valuation when the high-dose Eylea results came out, looking at Roche's first quarter of commercialization of Vabysmo, there is tremendous value creation and destruction that is happening in the wet AMD area. And so it just feels to me that along all three fronts that we as investors evaluate, which is to say clinical, regulatory, and commercial, in each of these spheres, there is a lot of value movement going on, and catalysts, obviously company-specific, drug-specific, in each of those areas are still very much in play.
Yep. John?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just make a more controversial statement if I could. I mean, I actually think the outcome of these two GA drugs, not only just from the FDA, but also commercially, are going to make or break ophthalmology.
Really?
In the sense that I think if they fail commercially and or they don't get acquired, for biotech investors to get interested in ophthalmology is going to be a very steep hill. So I think the implications are not just for retina, it's actually for the entire sector of ophthalmology. And just to give you a little bit of analogy, if you were to look at the anti-infective market, essentially dead from a biotech investment point of view, dermatology is kind of one step, kind of almost in the grave, and ophthalmology is one step behind. Because if you think about GA, it's one of the last big multi-billion potential markets. And if these drugs can't be successful and get acquired, well, what would be? And so for biotech venture investors, I think these launches and or approvals are literally the determinant of what will happen to ophthalmology in the next 2 or 3 years.
That's a lot of pressure. Thank you. Wow. Okay. So Paul, let me switch to you. As a CEO
I'm willing to counter, at least.
Say what?
I'm willing to counter at least on a positive side.
Go ahead, counter.
So we have in other therapeutic areas seen dips, right? Take cardiovascular has been an area where there was a massive dip for many, many years. We've seen myocardia was acquired for $14 billion. It's sort of a rare disease, potentially broader. Look at neurology now with what's happened. CTAD had a pretty incredible conference just earlier this week. And you probably would have said that neurology was dead as well for some period of time. So I do think that the field is still resilient enough, but it does have to sometimes make it through some of these harder times. So at least there's a light, for sure.
And I'm saying if the GA drugs are successful, it flips the other direction. Right?
Absolutely.
Because I think it demonstrates the markets are real, pharma gets re-engaged in the space. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying if those two were not to do well, then I think it's a very tough sell.
Well, I still like what you said, Chen. I mean, I like having the power of taking down dry eye altogether by failing. That's not bad at all. So good. So I like that.
Just to add to that, I think it'd be really incumbent on the manufacturers of those drugs in GA to really, really define the population that would find most utility.
So okay, I didn't expect that, but very interesting. So Paul, let me turn to you. We're talking about small companies, large companies, but at the end of the day, as a CEO of a startup, you've been out there raising money. Yeah. I'm interested in learning what you've encountered. What are the challenges of raising capital? Probably quite different in this environment for a small company as opposed to a larger company, right? So what are your challenges? What are the investors asking you in this environment?
Sure, no, it's a great question. I mean, I'd like to think of it not necessarily what are the challenges, but what are the opportunities. And we've been very fortunate at Ray Therapeutics. We had a seed round last year that was heavily oversubscribed, and then we were fortunate to receive a $4 million grant from California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And now we're embarking on a Series A, which so far has been very robust. But yeah, the investors are very sophisticated. They're asking, all of the right questions. One of the questions that they're asking, which is very appropriate, it's come up, on this panel, is what is the exit strategy? We've been, again, particularly fortunate because there has been strategic interest, and maybe it's because of the specific field of optogenetics. I think we're poised, very well. So I can only talk about our particular experience, but I think even, Cameron and John's, talk before, I think there is, reason to be enthusiastic. It's not as gloomy.
Let me ask you this. I mean, you're in gene therapy, and Chen put it in a way that's the entire field, right? Where they look at some markers, and if that doesn't work, the entire field suffers or goes down, as he says. In your case, in gene therapy, there have been some gene therapy failures recently, right? Does that have collateral damage on what you're trying to do?
I mean, not so much because we're able to differentiate ourselves. So our therapy is agnostic to the genetic mutation. There's already, very solid safety established in the optogenetics field. And then, of course, it's, building confidence in the team, in the development pathway, in the commercial opportunity. So I think if you can demonstrate what the investors are looking for. And again, they're sophisticated and they're asking the tough questions. Like, by no means, is it an easy process? But if you're able to, to deliver the proper answers that they're looking for, I think there's a lot of opportunities to get to sufficient funding.
Yep. Annabelle, best for last. When you, as an analyst, look in this environment at companies and you decide whether they're going to be successful or not, have your parameters changed at all in this environment?
I don't think it's changed all that much. I mean, investors in general are right now very focused on macroeconomic factors, and that obviously is a change in this environment. In this environment, they're also very risk averse. So, I would say that the assets and the indications that people are going after is very important. I would say that most are interested in if it's a novel mechanism of action, whether it's an unmet need, if it's an established market, where's the unmet need within that established market, and how are you improving on things like, the perfect example is wet AMD. You've got a pretty decent amount of drugs right now, but the issue is compliance. You need durability. So is the technology sufficient for durability? Is it safe enough? Because you're not going to sacrifice durability for safety. So these are some of the things that everyone's looking at. On top of that, they want predictability. And one of the things that we notice now in this risk-averse environment is that people are much more short-term focused, unfortunately. I mean, you're not getting the long-term investors. The long-term investors are the generalists who've backed away, and the short-term investors are looking for the catalysts. So it's extremely short-term focused, and it creates a lot of volatility. So a company has to have some catalysts so that they can keep people engaged in the story. So those are some of the things that you kind of always have to focus on when you're thinking about this environment.
So let me ask you a follow-on question, then I'd like everybody else to respond to the same question. And it sounds like a simple question, but it's not. Especially in this kind of environment, when you look at a company, and starting with you, Annabelle, I know that we're focused on assets, but how much more are you focused on management than you used to be?
Well, I would say the asset always goes first. If you have a good asset, that's the first place to start with. But I wouldn't discount management. Management is very important. Bad management, a good management team can't make a bad asset work. A bad management team will make a good asset fail. So it has to be the asset first, and then the management team is not that far behind, to be honest with you.
And how about from the investors? Chen and Rael, what about that question? How much do you focus on management asset? Is it? I mean, obviously asset comes first, but is management becoming more important in this environment to you?
I'd like to think, management, at least in my investment process, has always been incredibly important for the reasons that Annabelle says. Drug development is so complicated and so difficult and so capital intensive and regulatorily intensive that you have to have people that are experienced at it, that are good at it, that know what they're doing, that can serve multiple constituencies, namely the investment community, the clinical community, the patient community and the regulators, and that takes a special mix of talent and competency that is it's difficult to find all in one package on top of a great asset. So yes, it's always been important, and I think it will continue to be.
Ken?
Yeah, I think it's obvious. It's great. It's important. Maybe I'll just twist a little bit, which is how do I define what is good management? There's the obvious, it's just the operational blocking and tackling. But I also think for me as an investor, it's actually the transparency and frankly the ability to just not oversell and just present the data as it, kind of as it is. And one of the things that really we struggle with when we see investors is when they just start spinning data, cutting things up. And by the time when we see them, I can tell you that they've already broken trust for me, right? And so I think for me, good management is someone who's able to say, look, this data is actually great or this data is actually bad. In fact, I'm moving on. And for those who aren't able to make that latter distinction, I think long-term hurt their kind of reputation, but also just frankly, just waste their own time. So for me, I look at it as how do I define good management? That's a really important one.
And Chin, while I have you there, there's one other thing that I was going to ask you since we asked Paul earlier on about raising capital. As I remember in your conference, you have had to innovate in different ways to fund companies. And I found what you did, really innovative. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of what you've adjusted to be innovative in terms of funding small companies?
Yeah, I think right now we're in a market where, kind of creative structures are pretty important to help create kind of deeper syndicates. At the end of the day, like as Cameron mentioned, this is a tough capital raising environment. And so you really have to be able to build not just, get one investor, but you have to get a bevy of investors to support these companies through these difficult times. And so I think being reasonable around valuation, I always tell people one of the important things you should focus on is your post money. Because if you're not careful on your post money, you end up in really tough situations. You can't raise your next round, or you're forced to push the company to a point and finance it to that point to get the exits that your investors need to be happy. And sometimes that's not the great strategic move. Sometimes it makes sense to build a company and say, look, I think the exit point is at 200 million. And then you should fund it and kind of design your plan accordingly. So I guess what I would say is that I think in this environment, thinking very carefully about what do you want to fund to your exit is really critical.
Paul, any thoughts in terms of when you look for the growth of your company, the development of your company, you're looking at developing the asset now. Are you already thinking about commercializing, or is that something that you'll wait until later on when you think of financing now, financing in mid-financing phase, long-term financing phase? How do you think about that going from development to commercialization?
Yeah, no, of course it's a consideration. When I'm thinking about when we're in the process now of the Series A, one of the very critical considerations is who will we bring into the syndicate that will be good for the Series B, and beyond. So it's absolutely top of mind.
And Annabelle, let me ask you, that conversion that we talk about now from development to commercialization, that's really tough, right? Can you talk about what you've seen in companies? And again, I'm going to ask you all of this. And Cameron, maybe you after Annabelle, in terms of the same thing from your point of view, because a lot of companies are in a stage now where they'll be successful, they've gone through the FDA or they're about to go through the FDA, and then there's a switch to commercialize. Why don't you tell us first, Annabelle, what you've seen and what advice you can give companies?
Well, we've seen few surprises on the upside and a lot of, let's just say, companies that have underperformed expectations. I think one of the things that's important for companies as they launch drugs is to specifically, like I mentioned before, define an appropriate target population. Now, GA is very, very large. A mistake that could be made is saying GA should go to the whole entire market. I think it's important to be able to define the population who will benefit the most and who will be the most motivated to stay on treatment. So that's just the population. It's important to target very well up front because we've seen plenty of companies trying to do a scatter shot and not really define themselves and where they should be. I think the second thing that we come across a lot is pricing in pharmacoeconomic analyses. And in a bubble of pharmacoeconomic analyses, you can justify a tremendous price, any price, but you can't do that in a vacuum. You can't just say, I've done this pharmacoeconomic analysis and this is what I would save this patient, and therefore I'm going to price it like that. You can't do it in a bubble. You have to do it against the payers. And the payer environment, they're not incentivized to reimburse innovation. So you really have to work with them. And there's the commercial side of it where you have an extremely fragmented market, diverse population of payers that's almost as diverse as the patient population that you have to negotiate with. And then you have Medicare that, in some sense is a little bit more straightforward. If you have an innovative drug, unmet need, they typically pay for it. But you really have to think about pricing very carefully on the commercial side. So that's where a lot of people, I would say, fall short and expectations get completely blown out of the water, and probably the primary reason people miss expectations. And then I would say, I think, thinking about your market, whether it's US or international, I would say the international market is very different from that. You have the single payer system. So because they have negotiating power, your pricing is not as strong. So you have to think very carefully about whether you're going to go build your infrastructure yourself, whether that's the point where you need to talk to strategics, and if they're the right people to build that infrastructure for you. So there's many, many layers to this, but I would say the biggest hurdle is pricing and payer environment, because they will always put a roadblock up. And there's got to be a meeting of the minds on pricing and payer side.
Cameron, from banker's point of view?
I would say actually for all of those reasons, right, that's why management is so important. It's also because they hire us. So, but at the same time, really, this is a very, very hard environment. And a lot of the easy pickings have been taken over the last several years. And so critical decisions in drug development, in clinical trial design, particularly as companies go towards commercialization, that's where management is absolutely essential. And in some cases where you have some of these founder-led companies, it's also knowing when they don't know something, knowing when to ask for help and how to do so. And then as we also think as we get into strategic and financing processes, that level of organization and that calm to be able to say, okay, I'm not going to rush, and I'm not going to say, okay, I need to go and do this now, and to be able to just hold steady and to go through a thoughtful and methodical approach is really critical. And so it's not just, okay, I have this molecule, I'm going to sit and wait and see how it turns out. There's a lot of other factors involved for companies now because it's a harder environment.
So let me ask Riel, you and Chen as investors. So you've got, this is generalized, and I realize that every company is different. Certainly, my company is completely different. But having said that, so you've got a company that has developed an asset beautifully, and now they want to commercialize. And you're big investors in that company. Again, very general question. What are the things that you worry about as investors?
I'll go first. I think the big thing you worry about is that the commercialization is not going to go well, because nothing kills a company's valuation like a launch that doesn't go according to at least the way the Wall Street analysts expect it to.
What's the main reason it wouldn't go well?
Usually it's because expectations are out of whack, and I think the best management teams and the best practice is one where management helps shape the way the investment community thinks about a launch from well before that launch takes place. The last thing you want as a management team is in your first or second quarter of a drug launch to miss what the analysts are expecting, and that either happens because commercialization's tough, so it just happens frequently anyway, but it tends to happen when the analyst expectations aren't in the appropriate place, and sometimes management teams can be hesitant to try to, we use the phrase talk down numbers, where they're perceived to be cautious about a launch, but that's just the last thing you want to happen, and that's what keeps me up at night about every investment we make that's on the verge of commercialization.
Yeah, Chen, I can say this with great authority, having never commercialized anything, that it would seem as though there's a real mentality shift, right, that needs to occur from a kind of a more of an academic thinking in terms of developing a product to commercialization. What makes you worried when the company starts thinking about commercializing?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously expectation setting is clearly one. I think the second is just the capital intensity of commercialization for a smaller company is often the other major issue. So especially in a capital market like this, knowing that you have, as Annabelle mentioned, investors are fairly short-term oriented right now. And so when you think about, well, how do you get paid as an investor? Well, if I've got to print a year worth of revenues, I got to wait through some potentially pretty rocky periods. And so there's a saying in our industry or in our investment sector, right? There's this concept of short the launch, right? Doesn't even matter what the product is, you just short the launch, right? And I think there are only a handful of companies that have been able to navigate that gap easily, and so that's why, generally speaking, you have to almost like shift investor bases right after the approval.
Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
No, it was just, even as a very early stage company, we're having to pay attention because that's something the investors are paying attention to. So what we're doing, even though we're entering our clinical trial, phase 1, we will go in with commercial grade product. That's something definitely in the regen medicine space that has crippled a lot of companies, is that they're able to have clinical grade product, but when it comes to commercial, that's where they get stuck. So I think that it just to build on your question from earlier, not only on the financing side, but on the development side as well, it's very important to pay attention to commercial from the start.
And this is for all of you, so just jump in. What I've asked you for when I asked you that is just general answers, and you gave me general answers. But would that advice change any, or would the concern change any if it was a company that was looking at a larger patient population versus a small patient population, or is the advice still the same regardless?
I'm going to pipe into that one for a second.
Yeah.
We've seen this many times. One of the big mistakes companies do is that this is such a large market, we only need such a small penetration. That never works really well. So there's a reason why short the launch typically works as an investor. That's one of the things you really need to understand as a company. So, again, going to Rael's comments before, that managements really need to set expectations up front. And if they need to be conservative up front, and maybe the stock suffers a little bit because people's expectations were so large because it's such a large market, set them conservatively first, because it's much better to raise your numbers when management teams beat expectations than it is to be in a persistent pattern of lowering numbers after a launch, because that's when short the launch works really, really, really phenomenally well.
Great. Chen, there are a lot of quotes that you have that we're going to take away from this and plaster this, right next to the Jimi Hendrix quotes and everything else. So this is for all of you guys. Anything unique about investing in or development of assets in ophthalmology that you can think of? You're across many fields, but is there something about ophthalmology or any particular part of ophthalmology that would be unique?
Oh, yeah, go. There's actually a lot of different call points within ophthalmology, right? And so you broadly would sit there and you say you have ODs, you have general ophthalmology, you have retinal specialists, then you get into cataract, and you have all of these different areas. And sometimes there is overlap for products, but sometimes it's very unique. And so as companies think about building in one category or another, it's not always that you could have two products, but they could still have pretty unique sales forces, and you could have different, buy and bill or just general approach. So there are other factors, I think, that are sometimes unique, because you could say, okay, if you're oncology and you're solid tumor, okay, maybe that's still the same group of people who are going to be seeing these patients. And so that sometimes is a difference in this field that we see pretty substantially.
Yeah, I would call out, Praveen, the regulatory environment, which is important for any therapeutic area that we invest in. One of the things that I think we and many investors spend a lot of time on is what's the regulatory environment? What are the regulatory precedents? How will the FDA think about an application that's coming before them? Wiley Chambers, I think, is the longest standing division director at the FDA. He's been there since 1987. And what is attractive about thinking about regulatory events in ophthalmology is that he is, I think, routinely regarded as one of the most consistent regulators at the FDA. That helps us think about these decisions. It helps reduce risk and helps us understand risk in a way that is a little bit more challenging in other therapeutic areas where division directors tend to change and where the application of regulatory policy is not as consistent as it is in ophthalmology, and that frankly makes it very attractive.
That's a great point. He is really the most consistent person that I know that I've ever met. I'm going to go right down the line to ask you this last question, everybody. Paul, starting with you. And it's really a simple question. So just like in 2 sentences or so, just let me know as a prediction in your crystal ball, where's this field going to be in 2 years?
In 2 years? Well, from my standpoint, we're going to make blind people see.
But that happens in 5 years with GA drugs. I would push it out to 5 years, actually, because I think some of the new innovations.
And by the way, that question is open. It's not just what Paul said, which is a fantastic answer. But I'm talking about business. I'm talking about strategics. I'm talking about the whole thing.
Sure. So on the wet AMD side, I think you're going to see a lot of next-gen innovation to really extend duration. I think there's some, on the GA side, obviously, you'll have a treatment, and I think the next step from there is going to be innovation from that treatment like we saw in wet AMD. And then I think there's other areas of retina that haven't been tackled quite as successfully, that could be more consumer-oriented, like presbyopia, for example. There's a lot of development there. So I think some of those some next-generation products may come out there, and DR was mentioned earlier, diabetic retinopathy. There has to be very, very good administration of a drug for a condition that people don't feel. So I think some of those things are going to start emerging.
Yeah, I would say I think if the GA drugs are successful, it will unleash a significant amount of interest in basically innovating on different mechanisms for GA and also extended duration. And so I think it'll be a great moment for ophthalmology.
I think I also see probably some strategic shifts, right? We obviously are living through some of those now, but perhaps more companies teaming up to build up sales forces, as well as also perhaps maybe the addition of another strategic or further growth, as we've seen with somebody like an Alcon, kind of getting back into the RX field. So I do think we'll have some more from that perspective.
Is that going to be a domino effect? And this for everybody, but I'll start with you, Cameron. Is it that once one strategic starts with one of these mega deals, it's going to be a domino effect after that, or is it still going to be kind of scattered?
I think for this field where it stands, I think going immediately to that sort of domino effect, I think is harder because there just aren't as many strategics. But I do think there is opportunity, and for mid-cap companies that maybe aren't acquired in either adjacent therapeutic areas or otherwise, right? They're going to have to think about where can they find value, and can I build a commercial scale? Some companies that don't start in the eye today, we saw Viatris decide to enter because they could potentially, right, continue to build. And so I think as those companies build a little bit, they'll have to continue to build their pipeline, and that adds a few other competitors and a few other buyers into the field.
Rael?
Yeah, Praveen, my sincere hope is that extended duration, extended delivery, extended treatment periods, and having heard from a couple of companies today that are innovating in this area, I think that is critically important for ophthalmology drug development. And my hope and expectation is that companies will figure out how to improve drug loading into the back of the eye and therefore reduce the burden on patients and providers.
Yeah, I love all of your answers, but I love Paul's answers the best, which is we'll make blind people see. And we've heard all kinds of companies here in the last day and a half, some in the anterior segment, some in glaucoma, even dry eyes, for goodness sake, and certainly GA and wet AMD. And there are amazing innovation that's going on. And at some point, I think all of this will be properly valued and properly recognized. And I think that's just around the corner. But I want to again thank Firas and Craig and Maureen for putting together this innovation summit. It's been terrific. It's great to see all of you, and thank you for listening in on this panel. And I want to thank all the panelists, all of you guys, Paul and Annabelle and Chen and Cameron and Rael. Thank you so much.